Hi everyone, I'm Marco.
I'm Derek.
And thanks for tuning in to the Page One podcast, where we talk to writers of all kinds about the writing process and their work and how they got their break in the industry. Hope you've had a good week.
I've had a pretty good week. We've had some interesting fan interaction this week. Apparently one of us has a really nice voice.
Oh yeah, that's right. After some fan feedback, I enjoyed that.
No.
I think we all know who that was.
I think I know that too, Marco. Well, it's definitely not
Sorry,
me with that
Tarek,
voice. I don't even know what voice
your
that
voice
was. That was going for deep and sexy.
All right, okay. Is that what that was? Who's on the podcast this week?
This week we chat with Jim Zub, who is a comic book writer, writes for Marvel, does Avengers, Black Panther, has his own line with Image
yeah.
D&D stuff.
He's had a couple of series with Image, which is his own characters.
Yeah.
And yeah, he writes Dungeons and Dragons comics, but also Dungeons and Dragons adventure books. He actually talks to us a lot about how playing Dungeons and Dragons as a kid helped him form that sort of storytelling process. So there's a lot there, even if you're not into comics or graphic novels. I think it's a really interesting episode talking about story structure and character development, especially the difference between creating your own characters and working with characters that are already established and owned by someone else.
Yeah.
So we hope you enjoy it, and we'll be back at the end of the podcast to chat a bit more.
See you later.
So did you always want to be a writer from when you were small?
I didn't know I wanted to be a writer. I was fascinated by storytelling, and I think that came out in different ways. My start in the industry was actually animation. So I started working as an animator before I started working in comics and before I started specifically writing comics. Mm-hmm. And I think having that art background has been really valuable in a lot of ways because it gives you an understanding of what's happening on the other side of the whole pipeline.
Mm-hmm. But did you, when you were a kid, were you always creating stories, whether actually formally writing them or even when you were just playing with your toys and stuff? Was it always the storytelling that you were drawn to?
Yeah, absolutely. My brother and I really kind of bonded over Dungeons and Dragons when I was like 8 to 10 years old. And that was really opened up for me this idea of storytelling and this concept of making your own stories and collaborating on them as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that has served me, really well in a lot of ways because it teaches you to there's an improv quality to it because you're obviously making stuff on the fly, but you're also you're building out worlds, you're building characters. It's a little bit of everything.
Yeah, no, totally. And how did that transition from that then into, well, first animation and then eventually into comics?
Right. So I started working in animation, just doing production work in animation after I finished school. And it was really fascinating to dig into the process of animation. But, as a starting animator, you're doing a lot of grunt work. You're essentially, producing someone else's stories. Mm-hmm. And so it was it was something where I just wanted to have more control of that creative process. And comparatively speaking, animation is obviously a very labor intensive, art form. And so are comics, but just producing a few seconds of animation can take, weeks or months.
Yeah.
And so comics was a kind of a faster way to work. I could get my ideas down and I could put them out in a much more cohesive and quick form. And so for me, when I noticed that I'd grown up reading comics, I was a huge fan. I went through multiple phases of comic reading, both superhero stuff and manga and web comics I would read online. And so when I kind of hit this creative wall where I wanted to do my own stuff, I started making my own comic because it was a way I could literally do the writing and the art and put it all together. And so that was like 2001. I finally kind of started my own comic online, did that for a couple years. And over the course of that, started to find kind of the comic making community, but also to appreciate kind of the medium and what was involved with it, and how, how much control you can have over the story when you're going panel to panel, and the interplay of visuals with, the text that comics provides.
So once you'd kind of reached that moment when you thought, actually, comics is what I want to do, and you started to work on your own stuff, how did you take it from that point? How did you manage to break in? Did you have an agent, or did you share it with anyone?
No, so most of comics, particularly in North America, is a lot of do-it-yourself kind of stuff. There isn't a lot of agents. There's a little more of that now with kind of graphic novels and some of the larger mainline book publishers getting involved in that space. But most of it is very kind of scrappy, and the advantage of comics is that there are so many conventions. You can literally get yourself an Artist Alley table at many shows and just kind of show up with your stuff, or you can put material online and people can discover it. And the advantage I had was that in 2001 there weren't a ton of people doing webcomics, and even if there were, a lot of them weren't putting out consistent stuff, or, everyone was kind of figuring it out. The internet itself felt so kind of new.
Yeah.
And so it was just a fascinating kind of time to be building and trying stuff out. And so I worked on my own comic, and then through that made contacts in the business, other people who were making their own webcomics, or people who were looking at these kind of digital platforms. And we started commiserating first online and then in person at conventions.
And was your first comic, because you're also, I think, an illustrator as well as a writer. So was your first comic one that was sort of totally done by yourself without collaboration?
My very first one was done by myself, but it would be years before I would kind of break through to a larger, the webcomic did relatively well at that time. But then I got distracted with other work stuff and life stuff, and I kind of got pulled all over the place for different, things. Life happened, and I still didn't know that I would be able to make a go of it, with comics itself. And so it wasn't until quite a few years later that the bug really bit me again, and I started collaborating with other people to make comics. My breakout was honestly like 2009, 2010. I got a few back-to-back comic projects that I put out there, and they were of higher quality and they were consistent, and people started to take notice of that stuff. So even though I had been working at a studio for both animation and then I worked at studios for illustration, this was kind of the first time people saw me as a writer, and they saw me as a story kind of builder, and that kind of changed. That changing perception was really crucial to kind of pushing, both my confidence higher, but also giving people a clear idea of the kinds of stories I was capable of. And so that book was called Skull Kickers, and it was like a fantasy comedy series that I did for several years, collaborating with Edwin Huang and Chris Stevens and Misty Coates, and we published that through Image, and it was a big step forward for me.
And the Image stuff, that's quite an interesting way in for a lot of people who want to break into the industry, because you still own your own line, don't you? If you go with
That's
Image,
right.
you still have all the copyright and stuff. And
right,
was it hard getting in with Image, or was it all right?
Well, the advantage was that I had been going to conventions for quite a few years, and so I had met some of those people, and they had seen the work that we were putting together. I got invited to do a story for one of their anthologies, and that really kind of turned their heads, because the artist that I was working with on that, his stuff was just incredible quality. And they were like, wait, if you guys want to do more stuff, you should, drop us a line. And so that was something where we had that tether, that kind of springboard, and we were able to build on it from there.
I've always wondered about the convention stuff, because we've heard from a few folk that going to these things is a really good way to network. And I have to be honest, we've chatted about it in the past, and the thought of going as a complete unknown, going to these things with like a table and hoping folk will want to talk to you, it seems quite scary.
Especially, I think it's maybe a British thing. We're more reserved about putting ourselves out there, maybe.
Imagine 6 hours, no one turns up to talk to you at all, and you go home. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is about meeting the public, and part of it is about the kind of commiserating with other people in the business. And you can do that online or you can do that in person. Even better if you can do both. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really valuable. It's valuable to build community. It's valuable to no one's going to discover you if you don't put yourself out there.
Yeah.
If you don't put the material in front of people, for better or for worse. And you have to be honest about the fact that you're just starting out. You have to be honest about the fact that you haven't done this before. And you also have to be honest about the quality, of what you are putting out there, because you're going to be compared to the other stuff, that people are seeing at the show. But there's something to be said for literally being there and being seen and attempting. And I think quite a few people appreciate that. They appreciate that, confident sort of step forward. And that doesn't mean you're going to make a ton of money. And that doesn't mean that instant success is right around the corner. You're going to learn a lot. I talk a lot about the writing process, the pitching process, conventions, economics, all kinds of stuff on my website.
Mm-hmm.
And no matter how much someone tells you how it's going to work or their experiences, everyone's going to have a slightly different one. Everyone's going to have, their own opportunities and their own kind of changes as they move through their careers. And so I can tell you, hey, this is how it worked for me, or this is what has been working for me, but you're going to find your own kind of path. And there will probably be quite a bit of crossover because there's a lot of similarities when I talk to people in their journeys about how they got their start and what they've done and, the kinds of opportunities that slowly but surely built them up. But yours is still going to be relatively unique to you in the grand scheme of things.
And conventions, you just told us before we started recording that you're just back from New York Comic Con.
Yeah, that's why my voice sounds so ragged. Talking for days straight, trying to, both on the show floor where it gets pretty loud and then after hours, we jokingly call it the convention after the convention. Right?
Yeah, totally. And so that's still an important part of working in your industry, clearly, is going to these things.
I think it's true of any creative industry. I'm sure if you talk to, people in theater, if you talk to people in any kind of art, they're going to tell you music, theater, anything. They're going to tell you, you've got to be seen. You got to put yourself out there. You've got to, make stuff and find those commonalities.
And so you had the success with Skull Kickers and Image. But
right.
More recently, you've also been able to sort of transition and work for the bigger companies like Marvel and IDW and things like that. How did that come about?
I mean, it's sort of fascinating because, Image is a major publisher. Depending on the time, they're arguably the number 3 or number 4 publisher of comics. But because of their nature as independent and creator-owned, I think they sort of are in a bit of a different category compared to the commercial stuff. Again, it's one of those things of putting yourself out there. So I put together, whenever you're at these shows, you're seeing editors, you're engaging with them. They're coming around to Artist Alley or they're hearing about you through other people. And, the term that they use for it is casting. It's almost like casting for a movie. When you're putting work out there, you are essentially auditioning. If you do a bunch of, and it's true of anything, if you make a bunch of horror movies, people aren't going to imagine you for a soft romantic comedy. You know what I mean? Like I did a bunch of slam bam fantasy comedy, and I got one of my first commercial gigs was, hey, do you want to do some sword and sorcery stuff? It's like, yeah. That's the shortest line between 2 points. You know what I mean? And so if you want that kind of work, if you want people to see you a particular way, editors are looking what you're showing them, what you do unfettered on your own time. And then they're saying, oh, if I like that, that's what they can do for us, And so that's part of the kind of process is figuring out, okay, like I joke around that Skull Kickers was my love letter to Dungeons and Dragons and Conan the Barbarian, and now I work on Dungeons and Dragons and Conan the Barbarian.
Yeah.
But it's true. Like, that's exactly what ended up happening. I didn't intend for it to be such a clear one-to-one, but it was really obvious to those publishers that I was passionate about those kinds of stories and pulp and fantasy, and that they could trust me with those properties, and I would, hopefully do right by them.
Mm-hmm.
And how is it when you shift from a comic line that you've had complete creative control over to something where you're kind of playing with the toys in someone else's sandbox, or whatever the phrase is? I take it there's more restrictions on what you can do, but is it harder, or is it easier almost to come up with ideas for stories?
It's different. Like, I don't think it's better or worse. It's just a different kind of working environment. Having the sandbox in place, the established characters or the established worlds, gives you're not going in empty. So you have to define some of that stuff for yourself, or figure out what you can do within the scope of that established world or character or space, and try and keep some of your own voice in that process, that you're not going to completely subsume yourself within it, because they're hiring you to be you as well. Ideally, if they wanted you to be someone else, well, they'd probably hire that person. So, it's a weird thing where you're like, I want to do right by Robert E. Howard, but I've also got to be Jim Zub, and hopefully find some middle ground and balance that it feels right, but I can bring something a little bit new into the mix.
And I suppose that's true, because I think we've all read, hundreds of different Avengers stories, but you can always tell in the good ones when the author's voice or their spin in it comes through, whether it's like a Whedon or a Bendis, that their style of dialogue or action or whatever, it's like an imprint on that. And it's interesting seeing someone's take on the characters that everyone knows and loves and has read hundreds of already.
Coming in from a different angle,
Yeah.
And showing people the possibilities that, what you can bring to it that maybe wasn't there before, or an interesting combination of elements that you've recognized in the work that maybe wasn't as clear before. And that's kind of an interesting, challenge to be able to do, to say, I'm not just going to do what's been done. Yeah. I'm going to do this kind of my way. And hopefully you'll enjoy it and appreciate it. It won't turn you off. It'll enhance your love of what's already there,
And how much freedom do you actually get to tell the stories in these universes that aren't yours?
Yeah, it's completely different. Like, every project, every editor, every publisher, and combination, and even under the same editor, I'll have different restrictions depending on the project. Mm-hmm. Like, there's some where the publisher doesn't have a clear idea in mind, and they're looking to you to provide that structure. Mm-hmm. And if you do so, they'll and they like it, they'll let you run wild. Yeah. And there's other ones where they come to you with kind of a clear set and a mandate. We need to get the story to here by the end of it. Are you the right person to carry it there? And you're like, oh, I've got a way to do that. That'll be fun. Here's my take on it based on your restriction.
And do you presumably you might even in that scenario, you might come up with an idea and they might say, well, you can't do that with that character because in these other comics, he needs to be doing this or that or whatever. Right. So
sometimes it's timing. It's a lot of problem solving. Like, you want to bend the thing this way and someone else needs it to be over there. And so you're trying to find a way to please both, but not, sell out the integrity of your story idea, or is there a way that everyone can walk away and feel good and that we're all supporting each other, particularly something like the Marvel Universe that's got, shared continuity between books as much as possible. You're trying to be a good steward while equally trying to be, creatively fulfilled. And it's complicated. Like, as much as people wish there was an easy answer or an easy formula, every project I work on is different in how you work with the artist and what their expectations are, what the deadlines are. It's like a constantly moving target. And the people who are able to thrive in that environment are ones who can be kind of fleet of foot, that they're able to figure out, okay, this editor doesn't like to work this way. I need to adjust my expectations. Or this artist needs they're handheld, or this artist needs to run wild.
Mm-hmm.
Can I work with that, with that kind of challenge in front of me?
Mm-hmm.
The more you're able to show that you can kind of roll with the weirdness or make your mark despite all the limitations, the more opportunities that can come your way.
Yeah, totally. For something like, if you're working on the Avengers or something, and there is a bigger plan, do Marvel sort of get their writers together, or do they email or something and say, right, look, we're going to work out this larger arc now with you all here, and then let you go off?
Exactly. So for something like Avengers No Surrender, which we did like a weekly release, we built it almost a year in advance.
Right.
And we actually went to the Marvel offices and we all sat around and did a big story summit and built this thing from the ground up. You're not always able to do that in person. Sometimes it's conference calls or Skype or whatever, you can do. And sometimes it's a very formalized process and you're emailing back and forth. And other times I'm just calling people up and being like, hey, I noticed this thing. It might end up invading your story. Can we touch base beforehand so I know it's not going to be an issue later? So Marvel will send us, for example, advanced PDFs of books as they're sent to press. So we have about an extra month of seeing what else is coming out there. And so it's a way to also see synergies where you're like, oh, wait, this is happening over in this title. I could probably mention something about that in mine,
And when you work on these kind of Marvel, compared to your Image stuff, obviously you're now working as someone who's having to work with an artist. How do you find the collaboration part of it comparing with when you did it all yourself?
Well, again, it's literally project by project. It can be very different. So sometimes it's really, really straightforward, and the artist and you have got a very similar sensibility and you're like, oh, this is going to be a cinch. We're all on the same page. And other times you need to send lots and lots of reference, or you need to be very specific about what is happening and why in this particular part of the story. Other times the artist is coming in and they're just they're enhancing every single aspect of what you wrote and bringing extra, depth and detail to the story that you never even imagined, because they've got such a clear vision in their heads of how it's all going to look. And so, you need to kind of inspire the storytelling, but hopefully get the hell out of the way at the right times too, that you're not trying to stifle the entire process. The artist is your collaborator. They're not the art robot. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're never going to be able to draw exactly what I envision in my head. But if I've written it well and I've inspired them, they're going to draw something really cool, or they're going to put together something that exemplifies those qualities as strongly as possible.
I mean, when we've spoken to other comics writers, they've talked about that variation in the sort of script that is given. And I think it does depend obviously on the artist and what input they're giving to you about how much information they want. But someone like Alan Moore was famous, I think, for giving the most detailed panels, and every panel had to be drawn in exactly the way he wrote it.
Well, there were some artists that I think he trusted more. He would write all kinds of stuff and then he'd see the final page and go, oh yeah, that works. You know what I mean? That fills the need of what I was talking about. And, it's easy to say, well, that's Alan Moore. You know what I mean? Like, sure. But Alan's also got, an incredible legacy, and most of the artists that he's getting to work with him are people who their entire careers have been shaped by his stories.
Yeah.
So if he wants to be a bit more of a control freak, more power to him. But that's not normal. And so I try and dissuade writers and artists, that this is how it's always going to work, that the writer is some kind of demigod, casting thunderbolts down or some crazy stuff like that.
And it must be, is it easier on a creator-owned project though? Because you're presumably, before you're even pitching that, you've got the artist that you want to work with. And so you've probably talked it through, and it must be an easier process, I would have thought, at least initially, until you've worked with an artist for Marvel or something and you get to know them.
Yeah, I mean, the creator own, you're generally building it. Hopefully, you're building it with the artist right from the ground up.
Yeah.
So they've got input. They know, what's going on, and or they've designed the characters, or it. I always try and talk to the art team, on my commercial stuff, but on my creator own, obviously, I know them. It's almost like a creative marriage you're going into on this creator own book, and so I want them to be happy. I want them to be illustrating stuff that they're passionate about and excited about, because we're going to be spending an inordinate amount of time on this together. So again, it's not just about what I want. It's about us building a cool thing together that everyone on the team is going to be proud of.
And as well as an artist and writer, you're also a professor. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I teach at a college called Seneca here in Toronto, and that's in an animation program. So I'm talking, all the time about drawing technique and animation history and storytelling. So that's something where you're constantly, interacting with people and building stuff with these students and trying to, teach them best practices, both in terms of communication and quality and output, all that kind of stuff. It just reminds me constantly of the things. I want to be a good collaborator. I want to be a good communicator, and try and instill those qualities in my students as well.
I mean, it's quite a different, because we've probably mainly spoken to authors, and obviously that is a much more solitary writing process generally, and at least until the sort of stage of getting an editor on board and things like that. Whereas it sounds like comics is collaborative pretty much all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, you're coming up with the idea.
I mean, the only difficult part is, there's sometimes you're, on a commercial project where I'm writing a script and I don't know who's going to be drawing it.
Right.
They haven't set the artist yet.
Okay.
So you're writing this kind of generic thing, and you're hoping that whoever they bring on board is going to exemplify it. You know what I mean? Or I've literally worked with some editors where I hand in the script and they're like, thanks. And then the next thing I see is the finished version of the book. And I'm like, oh, I guess I'm not involved, And so that's how that editor works, and that's their process. And in some ways it's less hassle because you got paid and you walk away, but it's not in my nature to do that. So it feels a little odd at times.
And what does so if you're a professor and you're writing comics, both creator owned, what does a typical day look like for you, if there is such a thing?
There's no typical day. So there's days where, a lot of my days currently are really intense. Obviously, I'm working pretty intense hours. I'll go to the school and I'll teach 3 to 4 days a week, and then I'm essentially coming home, having dinner with my wife, go up to the studio, and I try and put in a few hours writing if possible. Or in some cases, you're spending the whole evening just responding to emails you missed during the day, playing catch up, and then realizing, crap, the whole evening's gone, and all the artists got feedback and all the editors know what's going on, and I don't have my pages done today. I guess I'm either staying up late or waking up early or finding some other point in my schedule to wedge that stuff in there. So it can be intense. It is essentially 2 full-time jobs plus conventions and promotion and all that kind of stuff.
It sounds like it is crazy busy, but I imagine it's also really rewarding from both sides of it. And is there a part of you that wishes you could write full-time, or do you choose to be able to write and teach?
Yeah, I could. It's been interesting because, the writing is, as a freelancer, is something where you're constantly feeling that burn of, oh man, am I doing enough? Am I out there enough? Am I visible enough? And then, the teaching affords me a certain amount of stability, which can be very advantageous, where a lot of writers they go through boom and bust periods where people want you and then people aren't paying attention to your work. And I don't have as much of that. There's some of it. But if I have a slow period, I don't have to worry about, is the mortgage going to get paid?
Yeah.
So in some cases, I can turn down smaller projects, or I can turn down a project that I don't feel is a good creative fit. And that's an advantage. It really is, because, it means that when I commit to a project, A, I know I can do it. B, I can bring my best to it. And it's not just a matter of dollar signs in my eyes going, well, that's going to pay the bills, so I'll be whatever you want me to be. So it means that in terms of my focus, like, Sword and Sorcery is doing really well right now. I have a whole slate of those on my schedule, and that's kind of by design. Like, I've picked up particular projects. I've worked really hard to get cast on certain titles that I really am passionate about, because I feel very strongly about them, and I know I can bring something into them, and I can leave holes in my schedule for them and keep kind of pushing in a way that a full-time writer might not be able to do, because they have a slow period and they go like, well, I just got to load up on whatever comes my way.
Mm-hmm. And in the writing process itself, do you, especially I suppose not so much the creator own stuff, but when you're working for the commercial companies, do you send in a script and it disappears into the ether? I mean, I think you said it depends on the editor, but
Depends on the editor.
Do you go through a lot of drafts, I suppose, is what I'm asking?
I generally don't anymore. Like early on in my career, I did. Mm-hmm. But because the artist is going to be bringing so much of themselves into it anyway, like, as long as I've said what needs to be said in terms of the pacing and the plotting and the dialogue, some of that's going to adjust during the drawing process or the lettering process. So I try not to get too wigged out about sweating the small stuff anymore. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like, that's definitely different now. But I've written like almost 300 single issues of comics. So it's kind of a different process now where I can kind of break a story and know whether it's working. I still go through a lot of periods of, doubt or all those sorts of things that we do, mm-hmm. the imposter syndrome and all that kind of stuff. But when a thing's working, I can kind of settle and go, okay, that's going to work. Or I know the artist is going to bring themselves into it. And if I have additional finicking I need to do, it'll happen when the roughs come in rather than, here on the page endlessly pining over different options on the exact same material.
And how is it that you go about planning stuff? Or do you sit down and plan out a whole story from start to finish, or the arc, or do you just kind of roll with it and see where it takes you as you go?
Yeah, so some writers are what they call, pants writers, or flying by the seat of their pants. And some people are planners. I'm definitely a planner. And I don't know if that's just because I came from animation and everything has to be immaculately planned in animation because you're spending so much money and time on every shot. Yeah. So in animation, you do something called a storyboard, and then you do what's called a Leica reel, which is essentially timing that storyboard out to music and a vocal track. A Disney film is essentially pre-edited before they start doing most of the animation, because they don't want to spend millions of dollars on these shots and then not use them. They can't just shoot more footage, spontaneously. And so that planning process really affected me in a good way, where that's kind of how I look at comics is we need to plan this thing out. I don't want to waste your time. You don't want to waste my time. Yeah. So I'll go in and very immaculately plan out, ideally, the whole arc of a story, or at least the issue that I'm working on. And I'll tell you, this is how many pages it's going to be. On this page, this major thing's going to happen. When we turn the page, this thing will be revealed. And that's like the big double page spread. And I have that plotted out, page pacing, if you will, all ready to go before I sit down to do the script. 95% of the time. It's very, very rare that I will pants write a story. So when I'm sitting down, I have that story plan in place, and I still allow for some spontaneity. It's not like I want to choke the creative process out completely, but I find it's easier to have the plan and then in the moment realize, I can do it differently or a little better than to just go in and grope around and hope I find something.
Yeah.
And when you're writing these characters that everyone knows, like a Miles Morales or something like that, is it easy to get the voice of these characters, or does it just depend on the character?
Sometimes, again, this sort of harkens back almost to Dungeons and Dragons, which is kind of a form of improv and a form of acting. You are trying to get into the headspace of the character. You're trying to figure out the voice. I do a lot of research reading on characters when I'm working on commercial stuff. So, I'll read as much material as I can for those characters, particularly recent stuff as I can. I'll take notes, pretty extensive notes in terms of their vocal cadence or key phrases or things that they say that seemed really poignant to me or interesting, so that I think about them. And, I write down thematic stuff. I'll write down symbolic stuff so that, it's possible when I'm working on them that I can call back to those things, or I can contrast those things. That means a lot to me, to be able to, particularly stuff that's got that kind of long legacy and continuity. I want to respect the work that other people have done just as much as I would want them to respect my work. One of the things that can be a little demoralizing is when you put together a story and the next time you see a character, it's like it never happened.
Yeah.
And you're
absolutely.
like, man,
Yeah.
I put in the homework. Why can't you put in the homework?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that's part of the job. And that doesn't mean that every story has equal importance at all times. We can emphasize or de-emphasize certain elements of the character as they grow and change. But it's to the reader, particularly, superhero comics, where the continuity is such a big part of why people enjoy these books, and the legacy and the idea that the Marvel Universe is this ongoing, growing, and thriving thing. I want to add to that. I want to build on that.
And I think we see that even in the film side of it, in the MCU, each film is a connection, and the Spider-Man movie came off the end of Endgame, and I think if it had been a whole different movie that didn't even acknowledge the events of it, folk would feel a little bit cheated almost, I think.
Yeah, I was really surprised when, the new Spider-Man movie talked so much about, half the population of the world vanishing. I thought for sure they were going to just not talk about it, because it's way easier.
Oh yeah,
to
absolutely.
not talk about it, because it's so difficult. It's such an incredibly crazy story thing to sort of handle.
Yeah.
And they did it really elegantly, and that's the kind of story problem solving that really impresses me about those films.
But that structure of the MCU it's very much the comic structure, isn't it? That's what comics have always done. They've told these overarching stories of different characters, and they've pulled it all together. So
the difficulty, for them is that it's an advantage and a disadvantage. They have way less time and way less stories that they can tell. We're telling, if it's a monthly book, 12 chapters a month or 12 chapters a year, and we're just able to cover so much more material. They also have the advantage of being able to draw upon decades and decades worth of stories and kind of cherry pick the stuff that works for them.
Yeah.
And then adapt it and update it. And whereas we're kind of pioneering a lot of the time, we're trying to find out, we're going out into the woods and trying to find new stuff and build new takes on these familiar characters and themes.
And is that something that you would want to do, you think, in the future at all? Would you like to work on the movie side of stuff?
Well, it's weird, because it's like, in some ways the movies are the movies, and they don't, they'll acknowledge the creators of the comics, but they don't necessarily bring them in to do story development. It seems like it's a bit of a different beast. Just depends on the company too, right? I mean, it'd be cool, obviously, if they use some of the materials that you put together, but how and when and how much, that stuff's so up in the air. I try not to worry about it in the same way that it'd be great if some of my creator-owned stuff was adapted into other mediums, but that's not why I make it. I make it to be a comic and to tell that story, and anything else is sort of icing on the cake.
Would you ever want to tell a story, your own story, in a script format, say, or in a novel or any other medium that you've not written in before?
Yeah, I've talked about potentially doing some prose stuff, and I did a little bit of adventure writing for Dungeons and Dragons recently, and that kind of stuff can be a lot of fun, because you're pushing out into a different space and trying to, keep your excitement up and surprise yourself with what you're able to take from it and learn from it. That you don't know this medium, and you're kind of pushing out into new places.
Do you think, just obviously the influence that Dungeons and Dragons and that the sort of role-playing storytelling has had on your whole approach to storytelling, it sounds like, do you think there's a danger, I'm going to sound like an old man now, but with kids playing just computer games that feed them the stories largely a lot of the time, if there is even a story in that aspect, that sort of use of your imagination is not used as much. You know, when I was a kid, even
back in my day,
back in my day, you would end up playing with your toys and telling stories,
Sure.
or playing Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, and there maybe is less opportunity for that now that video games have become so large.
It's actually fascinating because Dungeons and Dragons is going through a heck of a renaissance right now. The book sales and the community is actually bigger than it's ever been before, because I think people are feeling a need to want to make their own stuff and tell their own stories, that they're feeling stifled by codified, commodified, commercialized storytelling endlessly shoveled at them. And the ability to sit around a table with your friends and build something unique that didn't exist before is very enticing. And so I'm not worried about people. I think people go through phases of, I like having entertainment shoveled in my face, when I'm feeling tired and lazy and I just want to be entertained. But I think we all go through phases of wanting more or feeling a need to be creative. And hopefully that, I've noticed in this generation, it's just as strong, if not stronger, with them than it was with me. They have access to so many more communities now. Although, online video gaming you could say that it's a antisocial kind of thing. Those same platforms allow you to set up creative meetups or find collaborators or go to conventions or, communicate with people around the world about your passions. And so it can be just as empowering as it can be, depowering if you let it,
Yeah, totally.
So what's next on the agenda for yourself then, Jim?
I've got a bunch of different projects in the hopper. A couple have not been announced, but I'm doing a book, an ongoing title at Marvel called Black Panther and the Agents of Wakanda. And it's sort of like Mission Impossible by way of Jack Kirby. It's big action-packed stuff. And the format is a little bit different from your typical ongoing comic story. There are these like missions, and each one is 2 issues. So we've got set up a cool premise, put our characters in danger, give them a cool cliffhanger, and then pay it off the next issue.
Right.
The next issue after that, another big mission, another cool story. I'm doing a crazy kind of literary meets Marvel crossover called Conan Serpent War, and it's Conan is back at Marvel, like the character is being published by Marvel again, and so I'm doing a crossover between Conan the Barbarian, Solomon Kane, the Robert E. Howard character, Dark Agnes, another Robert E. Howard character, and Moon Knight, who recently got announced that he's going to have a TV show on Disney Plus. And so it's like kind of cool, pulpy, strange sword and sorcery story. It's got like time travel and dimensional portals and elder gods and all kinds of funky stuff.
That's quite a mashup of random characters together.
Yeah, I mean, Robert E. Howard's kind of imagination was so potent, and taking some of the stuff that is similar about those characters and reflecting on them and putting them into this big epic has been a really cool challenge that I'm really excited about. And people on our team, we're all responding really excited too as the art comes in. So that launches in December. I'm doing the ongoing Dungeons and Dragons official comic, and our newest story is called Infernal Tides, and that launches in November. And I'm working with longtime collaborator Max Dunbar, and we just love working together. He's a phenomenal talent, and he's doing the best art of his career on this book, and we're just attached at the hip on it, having an absolute blast. So those are kind of the major ones coming down the pipe for me right now, along with finishing up, kind of current other stuff that I've been doing. My wife and I and a good friend of ours, we're collaborating on these series of books for Random House called the Dungeons and Dragons Young Adventurers Guides that are introducing people to the precepts of tabletop role-playing games and, how to ignite their creativity. And that's a real passion project for me that people have responded to really strongly.
Oh, that's great. Well, it sounds like you've got a pretty full slate on the go. what was the last thing that you read, whether it was a book or a comic? What was the last thing?
Oh, comics. I'm reading comics constantly. Like I said, Marvel sends the continuity writers every comic that they're publishing. Mm-hmm. So I'm getting somewhere in excess of, 50 or 60 comics a month easily. So every single day, when I'm heading to the school and I'm on the subway, I'm usually reading comics, either Marvel books or comics my friends are producing or stuff like that. So It's a little nuts. So any day of the week you ask me, I've read something different, and I'm trying to keep up on either books I like or books that have some tethers to other projects, at Marvel that I'm working on. So I'm reading, Jason Aaron's Conan the Barbarian issues because I'm doing Conan stuff right now. So I want to make sure that it feels like the same character and we're playing in the same, playground and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Cool.
What was the last film you saw?
In the theaters, or
it could be anywhere, I suppose.
I'm trying to think. My wife and I are watching the new Dark Crystal series on Netflix.
Yeah. I've not watched that.
Yeah, I know that's not a movie, but we're really enjoying that.
I haven't watched the film for years. I remember the film freaked me out a little bit as a kid. It was the baddies. I can't remember their names, but there was something about their faces really freaked me out. Yeah,
we rewatched the old movie because we thought that the new series was like a sequel, but it's like a kind of a remake. They're kind of doing it from the ground up. And the old movie is good, but it's like very on the nose. Mm-hmm. And the new series has the benefit of, obviously decades of improvements in technology and storytelling and all this kind of stuff. Plus, because it's a mini series, they can get a lot more into the world building and nuance and stuff like that the movie just didn't have the runtime to do.
Cool.
Yeah.
And then the last thing we do is sort of either or questions. So we'll just throw two things at you, a few of them, and you just say the one that you prefer or that jumps into your head. So
sure.
Peter Parker or Miles Morales?
I mean, Peter Parker, because that's who I grew up on. I was a huge Spider-Man, collector when I was a kid. So he's my first Spidey.
I think he's everyone's favorite because he's also a school kid, and I think as a school kid, he's not some kind of god or whatever. He's actually someone.
That being said, I absolutely love Spider-Verse. I was so blown away.
Spider-Verse was fantastic.
I went to the theater, and Dan Slott, who was still writing Amazing Spider-Man at the time, he's like, you have to go. And I was like, I'll get to it. I'll check it out eventually. He's like, go right now. I was like, well. And so we saw it that opening weekend, and I was absolutely just jaw-dropping, how stellar it was and how consistent it was and how poignant it was.
It was amazing.
The imagination in that film was absolutely fantastic.
Just stunning. Yeah.
Heath Ledger Joker or Joaquin Phoenix Joker?
I don't give a shit about either of them. I just I don't know. The Joker to me is like a comic book character. I just the Dark Knight's got a pretty cool movie, but the movie Jokers have always felt like they're trying to be something, I don't know, like edgelord cool. Mm-hmm. I don't care. I just means nothing to me.
Fair enough. TV or cinema?
That's a weird question. I don't know. My first thing that came into my head was movies, just because the scope of it and the, going to the movies is such a social kind of thing, and you wind yourself into a hole just endlessly watching TV. Mm-hmm. I don't watch a lot of TV. I mean, like a lot of people, I tend to watch the streaming stuff. It's only when I'm traveling that I'll sometimes turn on the TV in the hotel, and 30 seconds later I go, well, now I know why I don't watch it. Because this is terrible beyond all reason. Exactly. And it just turns your brain into mush.
Last one, Star Wars or Star Trek?
I was a Star Wars kid, growing up. My brother was he was more of a Trekker. He was really into Next Generation. Mm-hmm. And I think almost defiantly I wasn't, because it was that's your thing.
Yeah.
I would watch it later and appreciate it a lot more. I think that Star Trek tells again, I think the TV format allows them to tell a lot more stories, a lot more nuanced stories, and a lot more involved kind of social issue stories that Star Wars doesn't tell.
Yeah.
But that's more like in hindsight.
Yeah.
Growing up, it was always Star Wars.
Who knew Dungeons and Dragons could be such a useful storytelling tool?
I know, it's amazing. You're a kid playing these games and you're using the exact same muscles in the brain that writers use as adults.
Yeah, it's a great thing for your imagination.
Yeah.
And it's, it sets you off on that path. Playing a game like that, it doesn't need to be D&D, but just something that stirs the imagination like that. And I think Jim had a lot of useful tips about storytelling there.
Another big fan of going to conventions.
Yeah, definitely. Just like Christopher Golden said, the importance of getting yourself out there, meeting the people that you want to impress, editors, agents, comic book companies, whoever it is, but also meeting other people in the community that are trying to do what you're trying to do, so that you can commiserate with them as well. It's important to know that you're not the only one trying to do this.
Exactly. So much of writing, as you've said before, is sitting in a room alone writing, and it's important to know that there's hundreds of other people doing the exact same thing, and it is for your mental health more than anything else. It's good to know that. Yeah,
I think that's right. And actually, I suppose in comic writing, as Jim said there, the difference maybe is that making a comic or a graphic novel is more a collaborative process. Although the writer is the one that might describe the scene on paper, the artist and the inker and the letterer and the colorist, everyone brings as much to it to make that real, rather than just the words on the page. So it is definitely a more collaborative process.
Yes, the writer's just part of a bigger whole. They're not the god of the entire creation.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks again to Jim for coming on, and I hope his voice is recovered from New York Comic Con now. Who's on next week, Tarek?
Next week we have ex-SAS international best-selling author Andy McNabb on. Very exciting. Yeah,
it was really exciting having him on. Andy was kind enough to speak to us. Andy is the author of many books, but his first book, Bravo 20, the story of an SAS mission which went wrong during the Gulf War, is still I think it's the world best-selling military history novel.
I think so, my understanding.
Yeah, so that's quite an achievement, and he's written many more books since then, fiction, non-fiction.
Kids' books.
We chat to him about all of that next week. It was really great meeting him, so it's definitely worth tuning in for.
Absolutely. If anybody out there would like to get in touch, if any questions or comments, please do send us an email, podcast@rightgear.co.uk, or of course you can always send us a tweet, which is @right_gear.
Yeah, we're also on Facebook and Instagram. Those links are in the bio, and also in the bio is a link to our website, which sells
Page One, the Writer's Notebook.
Yes, which we've mentioned a couple of times before. But it's a notebook we've created to help writers plan and structure their story. And because this month is what's known as NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month, we've got a special offer on in the store where you can where all the books are discounted, and you can get a further discount if you use the podcast code POD10. You'll get an extra 10% off.
Double discount.
So we'll leave you with a few more words about Page One, but we'll see you next week.
See you later.
Bye. The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realise it's not just a story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page one.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.